Hello and welcome to another episode of Fantasy Reality slash Gardening in Western New York, I guess. A little bit of a crossover. And okay. Well, whether it called for a change of venue due to the fact that it's raining. So, trying to film this outside, no sense. Today's episode, as I mentioned, is a crossover between Fantasy Reality and my Berry Garden in Western New York series. Because what I'm going to talk about is farming in a fantasy world. For a long time, in medieval times, the yard that a lot of us take for granted didn't exist. Though very few people had a yard that was filled with grass as we know it. The lawn, as we know it, did not exist. Because back then, food was the most important thing a person could have. And a lot of people during that time period, they would dedicate every square inch that they had. But if it was not being utilized for one thing, they used it to grow food, or herbs, or plants in general. They did not grow a lawn. So, how do you apply that to a fantasy setting? Well, if they were wealthy, such as someone of nobility, a lawn such as what we have could be done, because that meant you had the money to just let said piece of land grow wildish, grass, just grass, and then just cut it. Reason is, what grasses that people did grow were things like wheat and barley, and those were utilized in making bread or beer, which back in those days was, because back in medieval land was considered, or time frame, was safer to drink than water, because at the time water was filled with diseases like dysentery, and getting dysentery just isn't pleasant. It's probably worse than just plain old diarrhea. And if you've had too much Mexican food or spicy food, you know what that does to you. Enough said that. And dysentery just takes it up a couple of notches. So, like I said, but I'm getting a little off track. So, like I said, if they did grow grain, it was to utilize it to make bread or beer or some other beverage that was safe to drink. So, but like I said, but everybody else If they didn't have, quote, money, they would dedicate as much space as possible to growing food. And depending on the size of our creatures, let's take the centaur for instance. They need now a human, who is physically active, needs around 3,000 calories of food per day. A centaur, assuming that they have the same sort of caloric needs as a horse, you're looking at around 15,000 calories, at least 5 times as much as a human would need. And so, assuming that they would need to have at least 5 times as much food, meaning that much more space would need to be dedicated just for one centaur. So, when you think about it, and then you got all these other creatures, some of which are omnivores, and you got those that are herbivores or are vegetarians, at any rate. And depending on the size of these creatures, these guys too would consume more than the average human. So farming would be very important. And even those that ate meat, as I mentioned in a previous video, farming would also be a benefit to them because they would need to grow grains and plants and the like to feed the livestock, the cattle, the pigs, the goats, the sheep. Those things would all need to be fed. So, if you're in a fantasy setting, the gardens would be huge. At the very least. Now, I mean, if you've seen my videos, you see the plot of land. You see what I have, and you've probably seen the field I have out back that I would love to turn into a food forest. Imagine if this was if our time was the medieval times, or this was a medieval fantasy setting type of world, that entire field would be filled with plants that could be used as food. Or alternatively, it might be filled with herbs that could be sold, because sometimes certain herbs and spices are actually pretty valuable, especially in the medieval ages. I mean, pepper, salt and pepper, simple things. We take those for granted. Back in the medieval world, in the medieval days, salt and pepper was worth quite a bit. And then you got all the other herbs, mint, basil, oregano, thyme. Some of those could fetch a pretty penny. So, a smart fantasy, if you're talking about a gardener in a fantasy world, because, well, the reason why herbs are so important is because you'd use that to season your food, especially meat, because back then they didn't have good refrigeration techniques or capabilities, so they would season the meat in order to prepare it for smoking or drying, so that way, because after a while the food is going to spoil, but the herbs would disguise the fact that it's getting a little bad and make it still edible. So, assuming that a fantasy world is not too different. I would see herbs and spices being quite important to grow. And in addition to all the other fruits and vegetables. And you would need to dedicate as much space as you could to growing food. And anyone who does a garden for either as a hobby or because they want to not have to go to the store to spend money there and that sort of stuff, they would have, you'd have to do a little bit of pre-planting. You would have to prepare the land a little bit. You would need to plan out succession crops, because some crops, they're going to come up. Let's take lettuce. What you do if you want to have yourself a nice large amount of lettuce is you plant some, and in about 2 weeks you plant some more, and in another 2 weeks some more, and so on. Because if you just planted the entire field all at once, you'd have a bumper crop of lettuce, but you wouldn't be able to eat all of it, or at the very least you'd get sick of eating lettuce. And I know what lettuce does to me, but enough said about that. And so you'd have to plan out in advance when to plant the crop, and when to plant the successive crops. Because if you just, like I said, you plant it all at once, you get a huge bumper crop, you won't be able to eat all of it. On the other hand, if you was the sort that raised vegetables to sell as money, then it could be done. That could be doable. You could raise bumper crops and sell it at the market. That's doable. But if it's just your own personal garden where the people you're concerned with feeding are yourself, the spouse, and the kids, again, you can figure out how much lettuce is each person going to eat and plant accordingly. You may need to plant a little bit extra in case some of the crops don't make it, but you're not going to plant a whole lot of, you're not going to plant like 10,000 seeds worth at once. No, you might plant maybe, say, 50, assuming that not all the seeds are going to germinate, because let's face it, they don't. You'd also, one of the things you have to take into account is what sort of environment is this setting in. If it's set in a place where it is somewhat similar to England or North America, you're going to have to think, what time of the year is it? For instance, around here, there's a time for cool weather crops, warm weather crops, and you can plant another crop of cool weather crops as the weather changes from, as the seasons change from late winter, early spring, which is warm enough for certain cool weather crops like lettuces and spinach, and then as things warm up, you could plant warm weather crops such as squash, corn, and a number of others. And then as the weather starts to cool down, you start out your cool weather crops again. You'd have to think about those a little bit. And of course, if it's someplace that's a little bit warmer, like the tropics, you can plant warm weather crops year round. And if it's someplace that's cool year round, again, cool weather crops year round. Of course, if you got snow and ice all the time, again, you'd have to plant accordingly. And sometimes what you might want to do is have an indoor garden that, depending on how your farmers are set up. You need to plan all that accordingly. So, so let's get on to the kinds of vegetables that would be grown. Well, good thing about fantasy is you don't need to worry too much about you don't need to be historically accurate as to what was being grown at the time. You know, I mean, if you want to grow, because let's face it, depending on in your setting, you could grow your watermelons, you could grow your collard greens, you could grow your cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage. You could grow whatever it is you wanted, because there are some crops that are considered old world crops, such as cold crops, certain lettuces. Those are found found in England, and found in Europe. You got okra that was found in Africa. Your various herbs and spices, those are found in Asia. And over in the New World, you had things like corn, squash, certain kinds of beans. But like I said, fantasy, you don't need to worry about specifics. I mean, if you want to set things where the farmer is, it could be that growing different crops is a way of showing off your wealth. I mean, if you're wealthy, you could grow nothing but herbs and sell those to make more money. Make money that you could then buy food with. Or maybe you grow certain plants that are a little bit harder to grow. I mean, watermelon in this sort of area, it's a little, depending on the type of watermelon, it can be a little bit tricky to grow, like the huge watermelons that some people love to buy or grow. Because around here, the more practical watermelon is about this big. Because there's like maybe 3 months where you have good growing weather for watermelon, along with certain other crops. So, and of course, some places warmer year round, you could grow the bigger watermelon. And you got to think a little bit about that. There could be variation within that same, like I said, with watermelon. If you live someplace a little bit colder, the watermelon could actually be small, but it could be super sweet, super tasty. Whereas down in a warmer area, it's bigger, alright, but maybe not as sweet. Unless you're one of those kind of farmers who's like, okay, how do I get the sweetness of the small ones with the size of the big ones? I could see a farmer who's trying to figure out all that sort of thing, and he could create a big watermelon that grows real good in cooler weather, and it's still super sweet. And likewise, you could probably grow a big one that grows good in warmer weather, and is also super sweet. That guy, it could be worth his while to work on that. And then there's all the other little details that they need to figure out. I mean, and like I said, and so, farming in a fantasy world, that would, when you think about it, that'd be quite a little bit of a project. And I can see a few other things, like with farmers who raise livestock, they would have to need a certain amount of, you have to figure out what kind of livestock are we dealing with. I mean, let's take, in real life, let's take a look at cattle. Well, certain cattle are really good milk producers, whereas others are better at producing meat. And then you got chickens. Some chickens, they produce a lot of eggs. And then you got chickens that are just better off as meat. And then you got some that are used for both meat and eggs. And a lot of animals could have dual purposes. I mean, again, with the cow, for instance, back horses were considered expensive, so a lot of what farmers would do is, if they had oxen, they would use them as a bit of a draft animal to help plow up the fields, which would allow them to grow food, fruits and vegetables. And also, when you're talking about, let's talk a little bit about fruits and vegetables. Well, specifically fruits like trees, like apple trees and pear trees, and berry bushes. They would probably have, assuming that you'd have a lot of different apples, for instance. You'd have, depending on how, because there's some cultivar, because when it comes to a cultivar of an apple tree, a lot of them are actually grown through grafting these days, although you could probably take an apple seed and grow that, although what kind of apple you get is always a mixed bag in that case. Whereas with an apple that's grown from a graft, you kind of know what it is. For instance, a Honeycrisp tree will always produce a Honeycrisp apple. Same thing with Gala apples. Gala trees always produce a Gala apple. Granny Smith trees always produce a Granny Smith apple. But grown from seeds, you never know what you're going to get in those cases. Same thing with other fruit trees. A lot of these are grown from grafts. So, and how they produce fruit is that you need 2 different cultivars. So you'd have to think about that. But although what could be advantageous is you have one tree that is indeed one that's grown from seed, because its genetic material is going to be different from, say, a Honeycrisp apple tree or a Granny Smith apple tree or some other named cultivar, or alternatively, one farmer grows, say, a Honeycrisp type of tree, and the farmer next to them grows something like a Gala tree. And this sort of thing could occur for every other farmer, where each of them has a different cultivar growing. The same thing with pear trees and citrus trees and a bunch of others that require those different cultivars in order to produce fruit. Otherwise, because if all the trees were of the same cultivar, there wouldn't be any fruit at all. So you would have to do a little bit of thinking on that, which would be, of course, odds are they would probably all be grown from seed anyways. But still, if you have like a quote cultivar type thing going on, where they're all grown from grass, you'd have to think about how to cross-pollinate effectively. And then there's how do you make more of these particular things, like let's take currants, for instance. That's one I've had good success with, where cuttings is concerned. You'd have to figure out which section of the bush or tree to cut off, so that way you can find a spot to put it at and hopefully grow a new bush from, or tree from. you have to think a little bit about that. But when you figure it all out, they can all be pretty useful. Yeah, farming is quite the fun topic when you think about it. And how to apply that to a fantasy setting. After all, you'd have to figure out how much space would the average peasant own, so you'd have to figure out how much of that to dedicate to growing food. You'd also have to figure out what kinds of foods are you growing in this world. You'd have to figure out how big is the quote peasant, and like I said, how much land would they need. Like I said, for instance, if it's a centaur, they would probably need at least 5 times as much property in order to grow the adequate amount of food, or alternatively have the means to make the money to buy the food. Because that's the important thing. You have to think. How do you acquire food? That is the one thing you need to think. One needs to think on because it's one of those things you have to think. How would the society function? And farmers is key, and the root that the rest of society needs in order to grow. Because without the farmers, the rest of society is going to crumble and fall over. But with the farmers there, whatever society you form, it might survive. Providing there ain't too many pests around. Well, that's it for this episode of Fantasy Reality / Gardening in Western New York. Alright, thank you.